First thing Daniel Carter noticed was the unbearable weight pressing against his chest, his mind. Foggy and disoriented, clawed for clarity, he tried to inhale, but the air was thick and stale. His body ached, stiff and confined in a space far too small. A creeping panic began to settle in his bones as he attempted to move his arms. No room, his legs trapped. Darkness surrounded him, absolute and suffocating. His breath hitched as realization settled over him, cold and merciless. He was lying flat, encased on all sides by solid walls. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the rough wood above him. He pressed upward. It didn't budge. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. His heart slammed violently against his rib cage. He pressed harder, throwing his weight against the barrier above, but it wouldn't move. No. His breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in, squeezing the oxygen from his lungs. A suffocating sense of dread spread through his chest as the horrifying truth dawned on him. He was in a box, a coffin, and he was buried alive. A scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He kicked, thrashed, did everything he could to break free, but the wooden walls held firm. Think. His fingers scrambled across the space, searching for anything that could help him. His hand struck something cold and metallic. His breath caught. He fumbled in the dark, fingers closing around a small, cylindrical object, a flashlight. His shaking fingers fumbled with the switch. The dim glow flickered on, casting a sickly yellow light inside the coffin. The confined space was worse now that he could see a trough of wooden planks forming an unyielding prison around him. His breathing quickened, then he saw it. A piece of paper was stapled to the inside of the lid, just inches from his face. Daniel's stomach churned as he read the jagged red handwriting scrawled across the page. "You have 2 hours." His breath hitched. His pulse roared in his ears. Then a sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence, a phone ringing. Daniel's entire body stiffened. His head whipped to the side, eyes locking onto a cheap burner phone resting against his hip. The screen glowed, displaying a single ominous message, "Unknown caller." His fingers hovered over the answer button. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to ignore it, but he had no choice. His shaking hand pressed answer. A distorted voice whispered through the speaker, "Dig your way out or suffocate. Choose." The call ended. Daniel stared at the screen, pulse hammering. Then the phone's display changed. A countdown timer. 1:5, 9:5. The clock was ticking, and he had no time to waste. As Daniel's mind screamed at him to move. His breath was already growing warm, the air thick with dust and decay. Every second wasted meant less oxygen, less time to figure out a way out of this nightmare. His fingers trembled as they brushed against his pocket. A knife. No, not just a knife. A switchblade. He exhaled sharply, flipping it open with a flick of his thumb. His other hand pressed against the wooden lid of the coffin. Old wood. Then maybe he had a chance. His heart pounded as he gripped the knife tighter and jammed it into the wood. A splintering crack echoed through the confined space. He didn't stop. Again and again. Each stab sent jolts of pain through his wrist, but he kept going. Sweat dripped down his face, mingling with the dirt that seeped through the cracks. His breath was coming shorter now. The air was running out. A piece of wood gave way. His body screamed in relief as he clawed at the opening, prying at the edges with everything he had. More dirt poured in, filling his mouth, his nose. He coughed violently, fighting against the suffocating soil. He could taste it, earth, decay, death, but then his fingers hit open air. His chest heaved as he clawed harder, dragging himself up, fighting against the crushing weight of the earth, pressing down on him. His arms burned, his lungs screamed, and then he broke through, a gasp of fresh air, cold, crisp, biting against his dirt-covered face. He pulled himself up, collapsing onto the damp ground. Daniel rolled onto his back, chest rising and falling in rapid bursts as he gulped in lungfuls of oxygen. His whole body ached, his muscles screaming from the effort of escape. He was alive. But for how long? Slowly, painfully, he sat up. The flashlight had survived the struggle, its weak glow illuminating the world around him. A forest. The trees stretched high, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The ground was uneven, disturbed. That's when he saw it. Another grave, and it was empty. Daniel's stomach lurched. Someone or something had been buried here, just like him, and it had already escaped. Then his phone VIBRATED died. His blood ran cold. With shaking shaking fingers, he raised it. A new message appeared on the screen. Good, now run. A crack. Daniel turned slowly, his pulse hammering, and then he saw it, a shape in the darkness, watching him. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his heartbeat a violent drum against his ribs, his hands, still coated in damp earth, clenched into fists. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of the thing. Standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight's weak glow dot, a figure tall, unnaturally still. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but Daniel could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness, watching him, studying him. Then it moved, a single step forward. The sound of dirt shifting beneath its weight sent a fresh bolt of fear down Daniel's spine. He didn't wait to see what it would do next. He ran. The forest was thick, the underbrush clawing at his clothes as he tore through the trees. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest. But the fear driving him forward was stronger. Branches whipped against his face, slicing into his skin. The ground was uneven, riddled with roots waiting to trip him, but he couldn't stop. Behind him dashed footsteps, fast, heavy gaining. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Daniel fumbled for it as he ran, nearly dropping it in his frantic haste. The screen glowed with another message. 60 minutes left. Keep moving. What the hell did that mean? Daniel didn't have time to think. His feet hit something solid, pavement, a road. Relief surged through him. If there was a road, there had to be a way out. A car, a town, anything. But then a sound, low, guttural, not human. His stomach clenched as he turned his head just enough to see. The figure had followed and now it was running, not stumbling, not limping. Running straight for him. Daniel pushed himself harder, lungs screaming for air. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the fog. His eyes darted frantically for a sign of civilization, a street lamp, a house, anything. Then a flicker of light in the distance, a cabin, his salvation. Daniel didn't question it. He sprinted toward it with everything he had, every ounce of strength left in his exhausted body. The thing behind him was close too close. He could hear its breath now, ragged and inhuman. He reached the cabin steps, nearly tripping in his desperation. His hands fumbled for the doorknob. Slick with sweat and trembling, the door swung open and he threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. Silence. His chest heaved, his ears straining. Nothing. Had he lost it? Slowly, cautiously, Daniel turned the flashlight toward the window. His blood ran ice cold. It was there. Standing just beyond the glass. Watching. Waiting. And then a single rhythmic knock. Tap. 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 Daniel's breath hitched. His phone vibrated. Again, he lifted it with trembling fingers. A new message. 45 minutes left. The choice is yours. His eyes darted across the cabin, searching for anything that could help him. Then his gaze landed on something that made his stomach drop. A door, slightly ajar, leading to a basement. And inside a single open coffin. Waiting. The rhythmic knock at the window sent a pulse of pure terror through Daniel's veins. Tap. 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 The thing outside wasn't trying to break in. It was taunting him. His fingers clenched around the phone as he reread the message. 45 minutes left. The choice is yours. What choice? His eyes darted toward the basement door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, in the suffocating darkness, sat a single open coffin. His stomach twisted. No, he wasn't getting back into a coffin. He wasn't playing by whatever twisted rules this was. But the thing outside, his breath hitched. The cabin was old, the wooden walls worn and splintered. A single rusted lantern flickered in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows. The air smelled of dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Then he saw them, the newspaper clippings, tacked to the walls, yellowed and riddled with age. Some were torn, their edges curling, but the headlines sent a fresh wave of horror through him. Missing, persons found buried alive, only one survivor each time. The game never ends. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, heart pounding. Articles detailed disappearances spanning decades. Some victims were found barely alive, having clawed their way out of premature graves. Others weren't found at all. One article stood out, a grainy black and white photograph of a man, dirt smeared across his hollow cheeks, his eyes wide with something beyond fear. The caption read, "The Last Survivor." Daniel's fingers trembled as he traced the name beneath the photo, James Winters. Something about it sent a shiver through him. His mind spun. How long had this been happening? How many had been forced to play? And not another message. 30 minutes left. Choose. Daniel swallowed hard. The knocking at the window stopped. Silence stretched thin. Then, from the basement, a whisper, low, almost pleading. Help me. Daniel's breath hitched. He took a step back. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to do anything but step toward that door. But something in that voice that sounded human thought the moment of hesitation was enough. The basement door slammed open. Darkness rushed forward like a living thing swallowing the cabin whole. And then, everything went black. Daniel's world was swallowed by darkness. For a moment, he thought he had blacked out. But no, he could still feel the rough wood beneath his fingers. Still hear the wind rattling against the cabin walls. Then dash footsteps. Not from the basement. From behind him, his breath caught as he whirled around, knife raised. Rusted lantern flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows along the walls, and then he saw him. A man stood in the far corner of the cabin, half hidden in the shadows. His clothes were filthy, torn at the edges, caked in mud. His face was gaunt, hollowed by exhaustion, but his eyes wide and bloodshot locked onto Daniel's with an intensity that sent ice down his spine. He wasn't a monster, but he wasn't exactly alive either. You made it out, the man rasped. His voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used in years. Daniel's fingers tightened around the knife. Who are you? The man took a slow, staggering step forward. I was you, he said. Once, Daniels. Pulse thunder. The name in the newspaper article flashed through his mind. James Winters. He whispered. A slow, bitter smile pulled at the man's cracked lips. You read about me? Daniel nodded. His throat was dry. You were the last survivor. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No, he said, voice low. I was just the last one they let go. Daniel's stomach twisted. James stepped closer. You think this is a game? His voice was tight, edged with something raw. You think you were chosen at random? He laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. No, they've been doing this for decades, maybe longer, burying us, giving us 2 hours. And then he trailed off. Daniel swallowed hard. Then what? James met his gaze. Something dark swirling in his bloodshot eyes. Then they hunt us. A chill crept up Daniel's spine. James turned toward the boarded up window. They let one of us survive each time, he murmured. Just one, and whoever wins, he exhaled, pressing a dirt-streaked hand against his forehead. Whoever wins changes. Daniel's grip on the knife tightened. What do you mean? James shook his head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you can't run. Not yet. Daniel's breath hitched. Why? A sound outside, low, guttural, unnatural. James' face twisted with something between fear and regret. Because, he said, voice barely above a whisper, the ones who lose don't stay dead. Cabin door rattled. Daniel's phone VIP or ATD. One new message. 15 minutes left. Choose wisely. And then a hand, rotted and clawed, crashed through the window, and the hunt began again. Cabin erupted into chaos. Splinters of wood flew as the rotting hand crashed through the window, fingers twitching violently, grasping at nothing and then at everything. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The air reeked of decay. James grabbed his wrist, his grip ironclad. Move! Daniel barely had time to react before the front door exploded inward, ripped off its hinges. A blast of icy wind rushed through the cabin, carrying with it the stench of damp earth and something older, something wrong. Shadows slithered in the moonlight. Daniel caught a glimpse of something just beyond the threshold, something that had once been human, but was now nothing more than a husk of flesh and bone, stripped of anything that made it alive. It had no eyes, only hollow sockets that leaked black sludge. It tilted its head, sniffing the air. James yanked Daniel toward the basement door. No time. Down now. Daniel hesitated. He knew what was down there. The coffin, the waiting death trap. But the thing in the doorway took a staggering step forward, its limbs moving in sync. A natural jerk. No choice. He ducked down the stairs. James slammed the door shut behind them. The sound of splintering wood followed. More hands, more bodies pressing against the entrance, eager to tear it apart. The basement was pitch black, but James moved fast, striking a match against the damp wall. A weak, flickering flame cast shadows across the underground space. Daniel's stomach lurched out. The coffin was still there. But now, there were 3 more. Each one was open. Each one had been occupied recently, and each one was empty. Daniel turned sharply toward James. What the hell is this? James didn't look at him. He was too focused on the match. watching it burn down to his fingertips. It means we weren't the only ones playing tonight. A deafening crash from upstairs. The creatures had broken through. James shoved Daniel forward. The tunnel's gold. Daniel turned, and for the first time, he saw it. Beyond the coffins, partially obscured by a pile of rotted planks, was an opening, a tunnel, carved into the earth, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. Daniel hesitated. James grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to look him in the eye. This is the only way out. You hesitate, you die. Understand? Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. Then he crawled into the darkness. Daniel's body scraped against the damp walls as he pulled himself forward, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The tunnel was suffocatingly narrow, forcing him to crawl on, his stomach like a worm buried in the dirt. The only sounds were his own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. Behind him, James followed, moving fast out above them. Muffled thuds echoed through the soil, the sound of something searching, hunting. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. The tunnel twisted, dipping downward at a sharp angle. His fingers dug into the dirt for leverage as he slid forward, the damp earth pressing against his skin. Then something changed. The air shifted, died. It was colder now, thick with an almost metallic scent. Daniel slowed. James, keep moving. James hissed. We're not stopping. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then he heard it. A wet, slithering sound died not from behind him. From ahead died. Daniel froze. His pulse thundered as he strained to listen. The sound was distant, but it was moving. Not footsteps, not breathing. Something dragging itself through the tunnel. The walls suddenly felt tighter, the space smaller. His lungs struggled to expand. Not then. James whispered, shit. Daniel twisted his head, catching a glimpse of James's face in the darkness. His expression was grim, his jaw clenched. You recognize that sound? Daniel whispered. It wasn't a question. James nodded. I've heard it before. Daniel felt his stomach twist. What is it? James hesitated. Then the ones who didn't escape. The words sank like a stone in Daniel's gut. Before he could react, the slithering sound grew louder, closer. Daniel gritted his teeth and moved. The tunnel curved sharply ahead. As he turned the corner, his hand touched something wet. He yanked his hand back instinctively, his stomach churning as he glanced down. Even in the darkness, he could see it. A thick, black sludge coated his fingers. It smelled like rot. James swore. Keep moving. Now, Daniel wiped his hand against his jeans, suppressing the rising nausea. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but there was no turning back. Because the sound behind them was growing too. Something was following. They were trapped. Daniel forced himself forward, pushing through the suffocating tunnel, heart hammering as he chased the unknown. The slithering ahead of them grew louder. Then a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing his wrist. Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Daniel's entire body tensed as the cold, wet hand clamped around his wrist. It was strong and evenly strong. The fingers dug into his flesh, the nails jagged and broken. A guttural sound rose from the darkness ahead. Not a growl, not a breath, something worse. It clicked out like bones snapping into place. Daniel yanked back with everything he had, but the thing in the tunnel wouldn't let go. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as panic surged through his body. James. His voice was barely a whisper, but James was already moving. There was no room to turn. No space to fight properly, but James acted fast. His arm shot forward, slamming something hard against the unseen creature's grip. A dull, wet crack. Fingers twitched, the grip loosened. Daniel didn't wait. He ripped his arm free and scrambled back, his breath ragged. His body was slick with sweat and dirt, the damp tunnel closing in around him. James pressed forward, his voice low but firm. Go, now. Daniel hesitated, but then the slithering sound returned, louder, angrier. They had seconds. Daniel twisted, pulling himself through the tunnel with frantic desperation. He couldn't see where it led, only the consuming blackness ahead, but he moved. Behind him, James followed, moving fast, diving behind James. The slithering turned to crawling low. Rasping exhale filled space, a sound that was almost. Laughter died then, a whisper, not from James, not from Daniel. From it, don't leave me behind. The voice was warped, twisted, wrong. Daniel's lungs seized, his mind reeled. The voice had sounded familiar, it sounded like him. His blood ran cold, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The tunnel grew steeper. Daniel's arms burned as he pulled himself forward. lungs screaming for air. The walls pressed closer, the damp earth swallowing him inch by inch. Then finally dash and break in the darkness. A faint, eerie glow ahead. James, Daniel gasped. I see something. James shoved past him. Move faster. Daniel didn't argue. He forced himself toward the light, pushing against the heavy weight of exhaustion. The glow grew brighter, closer, a few feet more. Then his hand reached nothing. Daniel gasped as he tumbled forward, his body spilling out onto solid ground. He landed hard, coughing, gasping for breath. James followed, stumbling into the dimly lit space. Then they saw it. A room. Underground. Dirt walls lined with rotting wooden beams. A ceiling barely holding together. And at the center a coffin. Open. Waiting. Daniel staggered to his feet, his heart racing. The room wasn't natural. It was built. James turned, eyes wide. This isn't an escape. Daniel's phone buzzed. New message. Choose. One lives. One dies. Daniel's stomach twisted. Behind them. The tunnel shifted, collapsing. And the thing inside it was coming. The dirt behind him trembled. Something big was moving through the collapsing tunnel, pushing through the suffocating weight of soil and rock. The slithering sound had stopped. Now it was crawling. Closer. Daniel's fingers tightened around the phone, its dim light casting eerie shadows against the coffin in the center of the underground room. The message on the screen burned into his mind. Choose. One lives. One dies. His pulse pounded against his skull. This was the game. This was how it always ended. James swore under his breath, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with barely concealed panic. No way in hell I'm getting back in that thing. Daniel barely heard him. His mind reeled, flashing back to the newspaper clippings in the cabin, the patterns, the survivors. There was always one. The coffin sat open, waiting. The dirt-streaked wood, the deep, endless void inside it might as well have been a grave. Behind them, the thing in the tunnel let out a breath, a slow, rasping exhale that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. James backed up, fists clenched. It wants us to fight. It wants one of us to. The tunnel exploded. A mass of shifting limbs and rotted, elongated fingers poured into the space. A face if it could even be called that formed from the moving flesh. Mouths opened where there should have been none, but the eyes were human. Daniel's own face stared back at him from the mass, a grotesque, twisted mirror. Daniel's body went cold. His own voice rasped from the creature's countless throats. Don't leave me behind. Daniel moved. Instinct took over and he shoved James toward the coffin. James shouted, stumbling back. The moment James' body hit the coffin, the lid snapped shut. The room collapsed. Daniel woke up gasping. Cold air, crisp, fresh. The scent of pine, the sharp burn of reality settling in. He sat up. He was lying in the middle of the forest. The damp earth clung to his skin. Remnants of the underground roam, nothing but a fading nightmare. His phone vibrated. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he raised it. One new message. You survived. For now, Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned, his hands digging into the dirt. There right beside him, another grave freshly dug. Wooden coffin lid poking through the earth. James was gone, and Daniel was alone. Again. His fingers clenched the phone, pulse happy. The game was over, or was it? 3 days passed. Daniel didn't go home. He didn't tell anyone. He knew no one would believe him. Instead, he spent those 3 days researching, digging into every missing person's case that matched his own. People who had disappeared only to return changed. Every case followed the same pattern. Person vanishes. Days later, they return, disoriented, unable or unwilling to explain what happened. But soon after, someone close to them disappears. The cycle never ends. That night, Daniel sat in a cheap motel room, his phone clenched in his hands. The screen was dark. No messages. No warnings. Nothing. Maybe it was over. Maybe his phone vibrated. Daniel's stomach dropped. He turned the screen over. A new message. You know the rules. Pass it on. His blood ran. Cold. His hands trembled. On the table beside him, an address appeared on the screen. Someone else had been chosen. Daniel inhaled sharply, staring at the address. His breath was slow, controlled. His heartbeat steady. He knew what he had to do. Somewhere in the city, someone was about to wake up underground. And Daniel was going to find them. Because now, he wasn't the hunted anymore. He was the hunter. Exo, the game never ends. To be continued.